Hi everybody, Peter Zone's Griniflix Adventure 8 and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be shooting some Milky Way with the M11 and a couple of different lenses. The APO 35mm f2, the Voigtlander 15mm f4.5. My location today, or over the last couple of days, is McMaster's Beach, and we've got some clear weather, so there should be some night skies that I can take in anticipation of a Central Australia safari that's about to commence in a few days' time, when I fly into Alice Springs and then take my four-wheel drive and camper back to Sydney, which is going to be over up to about 2-week period by which to get it back. Today's video is really just seeing some of the shots I've taken around McMaster's in preparation for the shooting that's going to happen on safari. We've got some challenges in Central Australia right now. We've got a huge amount of rainfall, which is the biggest challenge of actually traveling in Central Australia, is trying to predict what the weather conditions are going to be like and whether you can get through. Heat is a challenge always, but at least you've got a good chance of maybe getting through on the dirt roads. But as soon as you add water, that's when the real problems start. Right now there's some huge rainfalls in South Australia. A lot of the roads have been cut, at both the sealed roads as well as the dirt roads, so that route may not be possible to get back to Sydney, which means we'll have to go north before we cut east across to Queensland and then down into New South Wales. But the further north you go, you get into the monsoon area. The wet weather also comes in from the north, so that's going to be a challenge. I'm hoping that there will be some good photography, both if there are storms and wet weather, then at least there'll be some good photography, unusual photography, in the sense there's going to be a lot of water around the place. And then if we do have some clear nights and clear skies, then camping out in the bush means I should be able to get some good night sky photography as well. In both cases, going to have to choose the type of lenses I take on the trip, and I'm thinking for landscape 90mm lens, and also general purpose 35mm lens, and close-up landscape I guess could be a 21mm lens. So that's the focal lengths I'm thinking of, is 21, 35 and 90, and I'll choose appropriate lenses for the camera. Now the camera I'll be taking is the M11, and my backup camera that I'll take is my trusty M240. I'll be able to show some photographs today in this video of some of the shots that I'll take and have taken already at McMaster's Beach, both on the two cameras. Obviously a big difference in megapixels, 60 megapixels versus 24. So you've got a lot more cropping area with that. And I put the Apple 35 on both of these cameras, so at least we've got one variable the same, which is the lens, and then be able to see what differences there are. The night skies and being able to do long exposures and handle a huge dynamic range is going to be important, so that's where the M11 comes into its own. And the M240 doesn't do too bad, but as long as you've got a really fast lens. As soon as you get into f2.8 and above, you just lack the light to be able to take decent night shots. I'll be able to show some examples of that. In summary, the equipment that I'll be taking on the safari will be the M11 and the M240. I'll be taking this lens, the APO 35, that's my 35. I'll take the Voigtlander, the 15mm. And then the two other lenses I'll take are the 90mm APO Summicron, also the Leica 21mm f1.4. I want to take the 1.4, it's a bulkier lens than the 2.8 that I have. But the 1.4 for night skies is going to be great because we can open it up right to 1.4, which means you can shoot faster shutter speeds, you can shoot smaller ISOs, so you can get a good shot whether you're using it on the M240 or the M11, so that you can get that huge dynamic range without compromising ISO. But then you can also have a fast enough shutter speed so that you can freeze the stars in the sky. So you don't have the streaky stars from the rotation of the world, Earth type thing. Let's have a look at some of the photographs and the things that I was trying to sort of work out over these last couple of days was, well, how do we handle the night skies, the dynamic range, how much can you push the raw files before it starts to break up too much? You know, if I'm using the M240 as my backup, what sort of shots does it make sense to do the M240 versus the M11? You've got smaller file sizes with 24 megapixel compared to 60. And having two bodies and having different lenses on during the course of the day is going to be great. Don't have to worry about changing lenses. I'm not really concerned about the megapixels too much. If you've got the right lens to the situation, 24 megapixel is more than enough. As far as video is concerned, for the Safari, I'll be using the iPhone, which I'm filming with right now. I'll have two of my GoPros with me as well. GoPro 9 as well as the GoPro 7. So I'll be using that. I'll take my trusty Nikon AW300, the little compact underwater type camera, which is indestructible, rugged camera. And on the M240 there is a video function on here as well, so I might take a little bit of video on this. I'll be shooting 4K mostly. The video function on the M240 only does 1080p, but again, in certain situations that will be okay. It may or may not be used as far as video is concerned. Let's have a look at some of the shots and then you'll see what I mean about megapixels, about cropping, about dynamic range, night skies, Milky Way. All right, so let's have a look at these two shots in full screen here. So that's one shot and that's the other shot. So that's the M240p with the APO 35mm lens, Summicron lens, and also the M11. So just flicking between the two, full frame like this on the computer screen or however you're watching this, you probably can't really see much difference. These are just the raw files that have been exported into JPEG and also made the same size in both cases, just to make it easier for handling and presentation. The raw files are slightly different. There's been no color correction, no exposure changing, and similar exposures. But anyway, you can see that's the slight difference. So that's the M11 and that's the M240p. Okay, now what I did do is I then cropped in on both and also resized them so that they would be similar, again, for the presentation purposes. So what we've done is we've taken one of these shots and we've just cropped in onto the playground here. So that's the playground there, and you can see that we've just taken probably about 1/4 of the segment. All right, let's have a look at those shots. So now we're starting to see some differences. You can probably just pick up that there is slight difference. All right, let's have a look at the next comparison. Now we've cropped in just into this sign here. So we've cropped in heaps. And then we'll have a look in full frame. This is the M240p and this is the M11. Again, no surprises there. You would expect this. A lot more detail in the M11 because you got a larger file. Okay, this next shot is with the M11 and the APO 35mm. The details as far as exposure is concerned, 64 ISO, I'm shooting at, I'm pretty sure it's 2.8 and 1,000th of a second. So this sometimes the Lightroom doesn't pick up the aperture, doesn't calculate the aperture correctly, so it can vary one stop either side. But we'll assume it's 2.8. The three shots I got here, I got the RAW file, then the JPEG that is actually produced in camera, and then I've done some editing on the RAW file to create this final image. So we can have a quick look at each one of these. So the first one, this is a RAW file. Lots of detail with the APO lens and also with the 60 megapixels. So if we zoom in at say 200%, we can see we've got a lot of detail here. And detail everywhere with the APO lens, and even at f2 2.8 we've got quite a large depth of field as well in this landscape type shot. We have a look now, so that's the RAW file. If we have a look at what the JPEG looks like that's produced by the camera, that's a RAW, that's the JPEG. So you can see it increases the contrast, increases the saturation as well in the JPEG file. It does make the darker areas darker, lighter areas a little bit lighter, and increases the saturation in the colors. And then the next shot, let's have a look. And this is my attempt at making some adjustments in Lightroom. We can have a look and see to what extent these are adjusted to create this image. Okay, so here's the original file, the DNG file, and then we can see what sort of changes that are done. So I've brought up the shadows quite a bit. See how much they've been brought up, possibly too much. The whites have been increased, blacks decreased slightly. Dehaze I've moved a bit, you can see the effect that has, and you can see the difference in vibrance by bringing up the vibrance. That's it, I'm pretty sure. Everything else was unchanged. So is that a better shot? Looks alright. Lots of detail, lots of colour. There you go. Alright, let's have a look at some night skies. Let's have a look at the M240p and see how that handles the night skies. The lens I've actually chosen is a Summilux 35mm f1.4. Lightroom says it's f4, but these shots were actually taken at f1.4. I wanted to make sure I got maximum light coming in through the lens so that the processor can handle it better. The first shot here, let's have a look at that, is at 3200 ISO. I did take a shot at 6400 ISO, but then everything started to break up and all the colors started to go weird. So really the maximum ISO rating you can use for night skies is 3200 on the M240p. So it's an 8-second exposure, 3200. All right, let's have a look at the next one. And here we're at 1600 ISO, 8 seconds. Now you notice here it's still 8 seconds. I was using automatic shutter speed, and so it would choose a maximum shutter speed that it could possibly do on the M240p for the ISO that's been chosen and for the lens opening f1.4 in this case here. So with the M240p, it only has a certain dynamic range, and therefore the camera limits the length of exposure according to that dynamic range. So at 3200 ISO, it was saying the maximum exposure time was 8 seconds. If I go on to the next one, I used 1600 ISO, it's still 8 seconds maximum exposure time. So when I get down to 800 ISO, then it can go up to 16 seconds, 400 ISO up to 32 seconds, and I think the maximum exposure time for the M240 is 60 seconds, so that's it, and that's achieved at ISO of 200. Things to watch out for once you're doing the Milky Way, particularly say at 35mm lens. There is a formula you can use, and that is if you divide 60 seconds by the focal length of the lens, and that's really the maximum length of shutter speed that you can use so that you get pinpoint stars, otherwise you start to get streaking. If we look at what happens at 8 seconds, they will have some streaking at 8 seconds, and if we sort of zoom in a bit, I mean, this is way too much. It's not actually even 8 seconds. So 35mm, 60 divided by 35 really gives you a maximum of 2 seconds exposure for pinpoint stars. And we've gone 4 times that amount, and it's not too bad actually. So we could probably put a factor of 4 times that by that formula by 4. So if I'm using the 21mm lens, then that would mean that 21 into 60 is 3 times by 4. So the maximum time period would be about 12 seconds. If we look at what a 15-second exposure looks like, you can start to see some elongation of these dots. It looks like a satellite streaking across the sky there. We go to the next shot, and this is at 32 seconds. And is this a meteor? Good question. But at 35mm focal length and at 30 seconds, you can start to see the streaking in the stars, and you can see there's quite a bit of movement there. So it might have been a lucky strike with this meteor. And if we go to the next shot here, and that's 60 seconds, and you really start to see the streaking quite considerably, and that's as a 35mm focal length. So comfortably with a 21mm lens, you can definitely do 15 seconds or 16-second exposure. Possibly stretch it to half a minute, so that's a 30-second exposure, and you do see some streaking with the 35mm lens. The good thing about a longer exposure is you can go for lower ISO, so you get more definition, better colors, you don't lose out in your image. And you've got more chance of catching meteors, meteorites, meteors, screaming across the sky into the atmosphere. With a fast lens, you can use the M240 at night time and get the night skies. If you can have 1.4 f-stop, great. If you go to 2, you can probably get away with it. 2.8, you struggle with getting enough light into the camera. I put the Voigtlander 4.5 f4.5 15mm lens on and tried taking a night sky shot. Now at 4.5 we are losing a lot of light. So let's have a look at what settings we got on this one. 3200 ISO, it is at f4.5 and it's 8-second exposure. That's the longest exposure I could get at 3200 ISO. But once we start editing, I know with this lens here it's got huge vignetting, and you have to actually compensate for that by doing some manual adjustment, bring up the dark edges. Let's have a look at what we can do to this shot to try and bring some light into the picture. We can start to increase the exposure, but as soon as you increase the exposure too much, you can see we don't have much dynamic range at all, and the image starts to break up. You can see the lines coming. So if we bring that back and we increase, say, clarity, let's see what happens. How far can you go? But you can see how the image starts to break up straight away. So the whole point of, if you're going to shoot anything on the M240p with night skies, you really want to use a fast lens, an f1.4, maximum f2, just to give those extra stops to actually get enough light onto the sensor. Okay, so here we've got the M11 and we've taken a number of series of shots. So let's have a look at the exposures that we got here. This first shot here is at ISO 200. It's showing f16 as far as Lightroom is concerned, but it is at f1.4, the Summilux 35mm f1.4 at 1.4 with a 75-second exposure. Yeah, so with the M11 you can go right up to 60 minutes, but that's choosing a very slow, very small ISO like 64. So at this setting, f1.4, we've got 75 seconds. If we go to the next shot, you can see we go to 400 ISO, 36 seconds, and then we flick through 800 at 20, 1600 at 10, 3200 at 5 seconds, 6400 at 2 seconds, 12,500 ISO at 1.5 seconds, 25,000 ISO at 0.7 seconds, and 50,000 ISO at 1/3 of a second. So yes, you can go right up to 50,000 ISO. Alright, let's see what sort of images we get with all the different settings. We'll start off with 200 ISO and we'll have a look. So straight away we've got 75-second exposure, and you can see there's a lot of streaking that goes on. Otherwise the image is fine. So that's at 35 seconds. That's about 20 seconds. Now we're looking at about 10, and you can see that we've got a lot of detail with the M11, so when you zoom right in you can actually see how much movement there is in the stars. 1600 ISO 10 seconds. If we go to 3200 ISO, and now it's 5 seconds, and zoom in. We can see we're pretty much a dot everywhere representing a star, so no movement. Alright, what happens if we push it to 6400 and 2 seconds? So that's the image there, still looking pretty good. And 12,500 at 1 second, I'm guessing that is 1.5 seconds. Alright, so what can you do with that image as far as development is concerned? We can increase the exposure. So you've got quite a bit of latitude still, it doesn't break up the image. We can increase the dehaze, the clarity. So you can muck about with your Lightroom settings. There's still a lot of latitude in the file that you've got, even at 12,500 ISO. If we go to 25,000 ISO, let's see how much latitude we got then. We start to increase the exposure. You can see the colors start to break up into into greens and purples, which you didn't notice so much at 12,500, but it becomes more obvious at 25,000 ISO. And that becomes even more obvious when we go to 50,000 ISO and you start to push it, and you can see that everything starts to break up. The lines start to appear if you go too much in overexposing it. So with the M11, I think in the night skies you can be quite comfortably go to 12,500 ISO, and you still got lots of latitude with regards to how you expose your image in post-processing. So that's quite impressive. Now the advantage of having that huge latitude means you can use a slow lens. So let's have a look to see how the Voigtlander looks like. The final shot is the M11 with the Voigtlander f4.5 15mm. Okay, we've got a number of raw files here. Starting off with this one on the left, that's 6400 at 10 seconds. Showing f16 as far as Lightroom is concerned, but I'm shooting at f4.5. And I've had to adjust all of these images quite severely. So it's 12,500 ISO, 3200 ISO, 1600 and 800. Let's have a look at 64, which was the first shot I took, and hence why all the horizon is off. And let's see what we've done there. So I've had to increase the exposure by almost 2 stops. So yeah, 2 stops I had to sort of increase the exposure by. Increase the whites, reduce the blacks. It's clarity and dehaze that I've increased here, which then brings up the foreground. And the vignetting is really severe on this lens. I've compensated for that. You can see how dark it is on the edges here. So by bringing that up to almost 90%, you can sort of balance that out a bit. That's not the best image, obviously. You can see it's starting to break up. The more adjustment you start to do, you can see it really on the corners here at 6400. It's to do with the lens, not fast enough. That's 12,500. You can see it breaking up there as well. And that has also had some clarity dehaze thrown in. Okay, if we look at 3200, so now we've got a bit more latitude. You don't notice any breaking up of the image. And well, we've got 20-second exposure on this at 3200. On the M240p, the maximum length that you could even get at 1600 was 8 seconds. And even at 3200 it was still 8 seconds was the maximum exposure. We can increase the exposure again on that. We've got quite a bit of latitude there as far as what we can do with that image. And we look at 1600, so we've got at 36 seconds exposure. What else have I done? Okay, I've actually put a graduation filter on this as well to increase the exposure in the foreground here. On a 15mm lens with this sort of image, you don't really notice it. You still see the Milky Way as being a nice image in this situation. If we go to 75 seconds now at 800 ISO, we can increase the exposure there again, and we get a nice image. There you go. So you've got the Milky Way over McMaster's Beach, 75 seconds at ISO 800. There you go. What do you think? I'm looking forward to the Central Australia trip to see what sort of shots I can get with the M11 and the M240p. Well, that's a wrap for this video. I hope you've enjoyed the photos. If it's the first time to my channel, And if you haven't already subscribed, then do press subscribe. Notifications if you want to be notified when the next video is out. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. That helps support the channel. That's important. You know, us video creators, we need as much support as we can get to keep this activity going. And yeah, so do stay tuned. I will do a number of videos of the journey around certain aspects of the journey, and they will be coming out in the future. So do press notifications to be notified when the video is out. Wish me luck. This video will be posted, and I will have probably started the trip in Central Australia by that stage. Okay, we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Bye.